Why consider local genres in translation? When people encounter scripture in familiar genres, it seems to have an impact. More and more translation and scripture engagement specialists are reporting that their use of familiar genres resulted in an enthusiastic reception of the material, even in contexts where the societal and religious norms would discourage such engagement. One beautiful example comes from India, where a man translated scripture into the literary tradition of Puranas. Here's a picture of one from the 17th century. One day, the translator brought some of his work to his guru. After hearing the scripture in this form, his mentor said in surprise, "But I didn't know the Bible was enlightened." The familiar genre had captured his heart and given him the respect to hear the text for what it truly said. Genealogies, laments, prophetic oracles, building plans, songs of praise, fictional, didactic stories, historical accounts, letters, sermons. These genres and more fill the pages of Scripture, a rich, colorful collection of communication in myriad styles and forms. These genres range from just one verse in length, such as individual proverbs, to long stretches of historical narrative, as found in Kings and Chronicles. Multiple genres may appear within one book, like Ezekiel, which includes legal style arguments, oracles, and laments, to name just a few. Likewise, one chapter may contain more than one genre. Consider the first chapter of Luke, which features multiple songs embedded in historical narrative. The third of the Phobi principles for Bible translation gives this mandate: to preserve the variety of the original. The literary forms employed in the original text, such as poetry, prophecy, narrative, and exhortation, should be represented by corresponding forms with the similar communicative functions in the receptor language. The impact, interest, and mnemonic value of the original should be retained to the greatest extent possible. We have a growing number of accounts of colleagues in the Bible translation world who have helped teams carry out this mandate successfully, using familiar genres to retain the impact, interest, and mnemonic value of the original. Here are just a few of the published examples. Despite this growing awareness of the importance of genre-level considerations, leading textbooks in the Bible translation world, such as Barnwell's of 2020 or Larson's of 1998, spend relatively little time on the topic. When I've broached the subject, most translation teams, advisors, and consultants have expressed uncertainty regarding how to identify appropriate genres, translate faithfully within them, and check the translations for accuracy. Most have also expressed doubt that the results could possibly be worth the effort. This paper is designed to address these concerns by sketching in broad strokes a possible process for identifying and working effectively with genres, presenting evidence for the myriad ways by which genre awareness can improve the quality of translations and their reception, and addressing various challenges and concerns involved in working with genres. In doing this research, I drew on publications within the Bible translation world, such as Zogbo and Wendland, Stark, and the others I mentioned earlier. But I also gathered input from other disciplines that consider genres in their research, such as cognitive linguistics, psychology, translation studies, emotion studies, academic writing, and ethno-arts. So now, getting into my findings, let's begin with establishing a working definition of genre. For purposes of this research, genres are emic distinctions for different kinds of communication recognized by a community. Throughout this presentation, I may refer to them as either local or familiar genres, meaning they are known by the community, whether they originated within the culture or entered the culture through outside influences. Each genre is marked by a bundle of features that makes it distinct from other genres within the culture: linguistic conventions, structural considerations, and performance features, among others. Braunschweig provides a concise definition. A genre is a community's category of communication characterized by a unique set of formal characteristics, performance practices, and social meanings. In other words, genres are not defined purely by linguistic criteria. They go well beyond the notional etic discourse types suggested by Longacre and Huang, and also include social, communicative, cultural, cognitive, and ideological factors. Clearly, there are different levels of genres. In many cultures, we could distinguish very broadly simply between prose and poetry. At the other end of the spectrum, in some cultures, we could do a very close analysis of proverbs and find patterns allowing us to classify different types of proverbs, even if the local people didn't distinguish among these different subtypes. For purposes of this paper, I'm simply referring to the level of genres recognized by a community as functionally distinct from others. If people have different words for a category of communication and recognize them as fulfilling different functions, then they are different genres. 3 practical considerations may be helpful in identifying and distinguishing this level of genre. First, we can consider the themes, determining which topics, attitudes, and emotions are generally associated with different genres, and whether the content is expected to be fictional or factual. For example, in America, we typically don't expect a joke to include a stern lecture about safety protocol somewhere in the middle of it. That would breach the normal topics, attitudes, and fictional character generally expected of jokes. Second, we can consider the discourse features, determining ways of chunking the text, the resulting sections to be expected, conventions for effecting transitions, marking peak or other points of emphasis, tracking participant reference, and any other features influencing the flow of information in a text. Letters, for example, may differ across cultures in terms of their conventions, as we can see in the way biblical letters were constructed compared with some Western letter writing traditions of the 19th century. Third, we can examine the aesthetic features and expectations, evaluating literary and performance features such as wordplay, soundplay, rhyme, line length, word density, or in oral contexts, the use of gestures, intonation, or other vocal features. For the Moloku of Cameroon, for example, the peak of any good story should feature the rich use of idiophones. Without that, a story just falls flat. With this working definition of genres, let's next explore how using familiar genres can fit in the translation process. Translation teams will of course be drawing from an inventory of genres available in their culture, with the end goal of matching appropriate genres from their culture with the functions required for the colorful variety of genres in the original scriptures. Teams planning to translate much of scripture can spend time eliciting as many genres as possible at the beginning of the project, so they can draw from the array of options throughout the rest of their translation process. Or teams can simply explore possibilities each time they encounter a new biblical genre. Of course, teams will need to identify which local genres match the themes of the original genres, which are well suited to the same topics, attitudes, emotions, and distinction between fact and fiction. As they build their inventory of available genres, they will also want to evaluate each option based on a number of anthropological factors, which I've drawn from Schrag and Zogbo and Wendland. For example, what settings are associated with this genre? A genre only appropriate within family homes or only sung at night may not work well for promoting corporate worship. Another factor is the culture's conventions around creators and performers. A genre only performed by experts might work well for making recordings, but once again might not lend itself to corporate worship. Then there's a genre's vitality within the culture. Do people still enjoy this genre? Will they be drawn to participating in it? What about the instruments, props, or other materials needed? And finally, are there any other spiritual, social, or other associations people commonly have with a genre? Anything connected primarily with animist or ancestral worship, for example, would have to be handled very carefully. After they have identified the most suitable local genre for the passage they're translating, translators can begin analyzing the formal characteristics of that genre, focusing on the types of discourse and aesthetic features I mentioned previously. Once they understand how their own genre works, as well as how the discourse and aesthetics of the scripture passage work, they can then translate the function of the discourse features into the functionally equivalent discourse features of the receptor genre. Remember the Moloko and their peak marking convention of using idiophones? For historical narratives, they needed to pepper their peaks with punchy words that helped the story pop for the community. For time's sake, I'd like to refer you to my paper for more discussion of translating discourse and aesthetic features across genres, with the understanding that it's a complex topic deserving much more additional study in the future. For now, let's move on to the evidence for how working with genres can improve the quality of translations. Based on the literature I reviewed, 3 broad themes emerged. Using familiar genres with skill can improve the quality of translations in terms of their faithfulness to the original text, their reception in communities, and the translation process itself. With each of these 3, I also identified a number of subcategories. Let's start with faithfulness to the original. Fundamentally, taking genre-level information into account allows translators to increase the translation's fidelity to the meaning of the original text. This increased accuracy can be viewed through at least 4 angles. First, genres often impact the semantic and pragmatic effects of statements. Take, for example, the sentence, "God has done marvelous things." As the refrain of a worship song, it suggests an aura of praise. As the thesis of a theological volume, it takes on a certain level of gravitas, setting up the expectation for evidence to be provided. And as a line in a text to a friend after an answer to prayer, it most likely evokes joy and relief. Understanding the original genre of a text and rendering each statement in light of that genre allows a translation to communicate the semantics and pragmatics more clearly. Second, genre rules often govern how to order and highlight information. In other words, genres may differ widely when it comes to the order people expect to find information in, or in how the most important information will be marked. I've heard consultants in some African languages explain the difficulties of Genesis 3, where Eve eats the fruit, and then Adam is suddenly mentioned in the second half of verse 6. When the story is presented in this order, the listeners assume Adam must be a ghost because he wasn't introduced as a primary participant at the beginning of the story. Likewise, Psalms often contain highly marked content near the center of the poem, while many Western cultures look for key information at the beginning or end of a discourse. Once again, understanding the structure of the original genre and capturing those functions in the receptor genre greatly increases fidelity to the original intent. Third, genres can also govern how emotions are interpreted. Linnefelt notes how narrative forms of biblical Hebrew show far fewer glimpses into the internal life of characters than poetic passages. For the New Testament, Inselman notes that the seemingly lavish greetings found at the beginning of some letters may simply have been what was expected in Greco-Roman letters, rather than an intense expression of ardent affection. Emotional content must be treated appropriately in each context, with its relative intensity matching the genres into which it is translated. Finally, genres communicate different levels of aesthetic value, levels that can be captured by translations into local genres with comparable aesthetic values. Obermeyer et al. Found that meter and rhyme in German poetry produced heightened appreciation in listeners, independent of semantics. If so, then accurately translating texts with high aesthetic value, like Hebrew poetry, requires incorporating features that impact the intended audience aesthetically as well. Beyond increasing faithfulness to the original text, translating into familiar genres often greatly improves the reception of translations into communities. Based on the literature, I would posit the following 5 reasons. First, familiar genres establish expectations for communicative intent. How does this work? Genres are already associated with certain types of meaning within a societal structure, and the features of the genre activate a frame for people to process the content. Wendland writes that language users, quote, never do any processing of language in vacuo, but always in some concrete situation. And the most important notion for the analysis of these cognitive models and expectations is the one of genre. So, when a team in West Asia introduced Solomon's wisdom translated in the same style as local proverbs, the community was instantly eager to hear more. As a closely related point, familiar genres reduce cognitive load. It's not as hard to process new information if it's presented with familiar communication conventions. In reporting on his work with the Digo people of Kenya and Tanzania, Hadisi claims that the genre features made material easier for Digo listeners to understand. As a result, the Digo people went from almost no interest in scripture to high levels of enjoyment. Beyond facilitating cognitive processing, communication in familiar forms provides a gateway to the emotions. According to Atkins, if people already have emotional associations with established genres, it paves the way for heart transformation and even shifts in worldview. As noted already in Obermeyer et al.'s study of German poetry, familiar aesthetic elements may even activate the emotions. Genres also appeal to cultural identity. Fresh instances of familiar genres often pique people's interest, drawing attention to the new material. One of my favorite examples of this phenomenon is the True Meaning translation by Al-Kalima in North Africa, which presents the genealogies in Matthew and Luke as beautiful calligraphy pictured here. They also present the songs of Luke 1 as lyrics fitting the culturally recognized genre nasheed. While many Arabs hesitate to read the Bible because of social and religious prejudices, these beautiful artistic products have found a positive response. People enjoy reading them and sharing them with others. Finally, the skilled use of familiar genres integrates material into established life patterns. If people encounter material frequently, it can become part of their collective narrative, thereby increasing the chances of long-term impact. John Stark's experience with the Kambari Language Project in Nigeria provides compelling evidence. The new terms being promoted through familiar oral genres only spread effectively when the material was presented in existing infrastructures in the community, like literacy classes. Let's move now to the third and final category, whereby working with local genres can increase a translation's quality, the translation process itself. Perhaps most importantly, scholar practitioners such as June Dickey and Murray Salisbury note benefits for the translators, increased engagement and ownership of scripture, and simply an increased level of enjoyment in translating. Secondly, working within genres can actually be much more efficient. As Dickey notes, it is much easier to add accuracy to a text than to add creativity. Of course, skilled creators within a genre will be much more efficient than others. So I would suggest finding local storytellers, poets, and other artists as appropriate to each passage being translated. The evidence is strong. Familiar genres can greatly bolster the quality of translations in many ways. As such, I would like to see discussions of local genres become a more common part of translation training and embraced more broadly by translation teams and consultants around the world. I recognize that this suggestion is not without challenges. In my paper, I address 5 of these questions. First, how much do genres affect the translation process? Do we have the exegetical understanding and resources we need? Are familiar genres always the right choice for a community? How do we measure if our genre-based translations are good? And how far is too far? Once again, I refer you to my paper for a detailed discussion of these points. For now, I'll provide just a brief response to each of them. First, how much do genres affect the translation process? In short, the answer is a lot, and at nearly every stage. To start, the whole idea of using local genres will ideally be addressed in the project planning stages. Those involved in exegesis will need to know how to look for the themes, discourse, and aesthetic elements of the biblical text. The translators will necessarily spend time thinking about local genres and how they function. Community checking will also include feedback to confirm that the functions of the discourse and aesthetic elements have been captured effectively. These are just a few examples of the way local genres will impact the translation process. As for the second question, do we have the adequate exegetical resources? Are we sure we understand the source text well enough to understand the functions of all their discourse structures and aesthetic features? In answer, scholarship is certainly turning its attention in this direction, as evidenced by the work of van der Lucht, Vockelman, and Wendland on the Psalms, or Garland on the Gospel of Luke. At the same time, I think it's clear that there's still much room for further study on this topic. In the meantime, I would argue that many majority language translations provide enough clues to identify macro functions, such as peak in narrative, emphasis through techniques like repetition and non-narrative, section shifts reflected by changes in topic, emotion, or participant reference, and important connections within the text between related words, lines, or sections. Simply translating these macro functions will greatly increase the impact of the material for the audience. Thirdly, are local genres always the right choice for a community? In my paper, I get into several factors that might influence this answer. I especially appreciate Nord's distinction between documentary translations, which are intended to reflect the source text as much as possible, and instrumental translations, which are intended to use the communication devices familiar to the receptor culture. Ideally, every community would have access to both kinds of versions. But where resources are tight, it might make sense to start with some passages that work especially well in local genres in order to facilitate people's first interactions with new material. For example, as I mentioned above, Proverbs in the local style made for a wonderful introduction to scripture for one community in West Asia. Of course, all these decisions rest with the project stakeholders representing the community's needs and desires. We can help by presenting the option of familiar genres, providing a realistic view of the challenges, but also of the extraordinary benefits. Moving on to the next question, how can we measure if a genre-based translation is good? Mostly, I think we can use the long-standing measurements of clear, accurate, natural, and acceptable, as measured through careful community checking. This notion of acceptability is particularly important. We don't want people to reject translations as not looking or feeling like scripture, but we also don't want them to accept translations as part of their culture without understanding that it is scripture. This issue is handled in the last question, how far is too far? Where are the boundary markers beyond which translating in familiar genres has robbed a translation of its position as scripture? I would propose two boundary markers, with the first being historical grounding. Translations must maintain a sense of connection with another place and another time, where people of another culture walked out the events and emotions in the text. Secondly, translations must maintain an aura of sacred authority, that this is not just general human communication, but communication between humans and the one true God. Though these may seem obvious, they apply to every aspect of translation, including how we interact with genres. As I already mentioned, all of these questions receive more treatment in my paper, which I hope will give you more opportunity to interact with them. In conclusion, translating within familiar genres carries challenges, but the benefits of increased quality are compelling. In his 2015 Bible Translation Conference paper, Murray Salisbury shared the inspirational example of the Punjabi Psalms. You can see an example featured here in Western notation. Although these Psalms took their poet-author 26 years to translate, they are still used today, more than a century later, even by non-Punjabi speakers. These Psalms are said to have created unity across denominations, given non-readers in the lower caste access to scripture, and made the Psalms the most familiar, accessible biblical passages in Pakistan. Likewise, the Scottish metrical Psalter, though translated over decades, has now been used for centuries. Both of these examples give testimony to the possible longevity and multicultural impact that can come through accurately translated, aesthetically pleasing, high-quality translations. Let's continue to strengthen the translation world with the vision and with the evidence for using familiar genres, so people all over the world can encounter scripture in the forms that speak most deeply to them. I thank you for your time in watching this presentation. I hope you'll contact me at katie_frost@sal.org if you would like to dialogue further about any of this material. May God bless you with joy in genres wherever you are working and living.